In the UK over the past week, the news has really been dominated by the Dominic Cummings story, and I've even seen some parody over this. The small town of Barnard Castle in County Durham, which is actually known for the Bowes Museum and the Swan automaton that is there. It's worth checking out when all of this ends and we actually can travel. It's worth checking out. It's also an ancestral home of Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the Queen Mother. Um, so that's been the big story. And yeah, I mentioned, sorry, acting from my own point there. Um, I mentioned there's been a lot of parody around this. I've seen people coming out with sort of songs online, 500 Miles, the Proclaimers song featuring Dominic Cummings. The brewer, the brewing company Brewdog has released a special uh, product for testing your eyesight, Dominic Cummings style. So, this is the big dominant story in the UK. But the other big thing that's been going on this week that I've kind of been thinking about, but I haven't had a chance to talk about yet, is the situation in Hong Kong, which was, of course, very important last year, but it's only getting worse. So the Chinese regime has now brought in new legislation via the People's Congress in Beijing that basically has ended one country, two systems in everything but name. And whilst this has long been the concern of the Hong Kong protesters, this new bill really seems to be the final nail in the coffin in some ways. Um, and I just read out from the Metro newspaper here. China has likened Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters to terrorists as it prepares to pass laws that opponents fear will be the death blow to freedom in the ex-British colony. Some actions during last year's disruptive demonstrations were terrorist in nature, said Xi Feng, Commissioner of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hong Kong. Thousands of protesters took to the streets once again on Sunday over the proposed law seen as a threat to the one country, two systems deal agreed when Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997. But Mr. Xi insisted there was absolutely no need to panic over the legislation that makes subversion of state authority a criminal act. He said it would only affect troublemakers colluding with foreign forces who pose a danger to national security. Well, firstly, any legislation in Hong Kong or anywhere else that is vague in its wording is potentially dangerous because what the Chinese Communist regime deems subversion could be any protester saying they don't want to live in a communist city. They don't want Hong Kong to become like Shenzhen or Guangzhou or Foshan. So that is the first point. That terminology is vague, and I think it's deliberately so in order to, well, at least deliberately in terms of how the CCP's propaganda is putting it out. And as for the idea of communist officials, right up to Foreign Minister Wang Yi saying, oh, the Hong Kongers have nothing to worry about, we will respect their autonomy. Anyone who believes that really is being very, very gullible. I've always said I believe that the Chinese Communist Party are professional liars. They really, really don't give a damn about the autonomy of Hong Kongers. And they know that they can just go in and, send in the troops because the world is watching closer, even with coronavirus, the world is watching closer than it was in 1989. The nature of mass media is different than what it was in 1989 with the Tiananmen crackdown. At that time, you had news outlets that could cover the event. You had eyewitnesses, you had survivors. There wasn't the sort of 24-hour media and social media that there is now. And as powerful as the Chinese regime is in terms of censoring content, on the Chinese mainland. They know they can't do that in Hong Kong and they can't do it beyond its borders. But this is a very serious situation because it's basically lumping all protesters into one category. Now, I followed the events of last year very closely. I am well aware that there were indeed some protesters who used less than savoury measures. They did engage in vandalism, and there were some violent incidents by protesters against other Hong Kongers. There was one ugly incident where a man was set on fire. So I'm not going to say that all the protesters have been totally peaceful. They haven't. But there are a lot of things that people need to consider. Firstly, the very real police brutality that has been going on there, that the Carrie Lam administration turned a blind eye to. I mean, it's absolutely shocking, including female demonstrators being sexually molested, um, accusations they were even raped in police stations. Um, so the brutality from the Hong Kong police is absolutely shameful. And this is the thing I really, really take issue with is that when there was more violent unrest later in the year, Chinese media was all over that. They said, look, this proves we need to take a hard line in Hong Kong because these terrorists, these rioters are being stoked up by pesky foreigners, stoked up by the British and Americans and others to try to undermine China. Yet, when there was massive rallies in the beginning, about a year ago, about May, June 2019, these were massive rallies, some of them attracting up to 2 million people, which is a significant proportion of Hong Kong's population. They were overwhelmingly peaceful. There was no vandalism. There was no one throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Chinese state media just ignored it. Xinhua, Global Times, CGTN, they barely covered it. They only started covering it when there was unrest because it fitted their narrative of smearing all protesters as, terrorists. This isn't unlike Bashar Assad in Syria saying anyone that opposes him is a terrorist. The comparison is that they're two totalitarian regimes. Any Hong Konger who's paying attention to this and really values autonomy should be very, very concerned about these developments. And it should also put pressure on our government to issue emergency visas. Now, the big question, of course, is will China let people flee the territory? That's what the situation now is. And there's other historic precedents, like when Idi Amin was persecuting Asians in Uganda in the 70s. Um, we may now need to issue emergency legislation, and it really is an emergency because there are a lot of people in Hong Kong who will be fearing a knock on the door from the police that they are guilty of subverting state power. This could result in a lengthy prison sentence. So it's very difficult to say Hong Kong is the city that it once was. It's just got more and more similar to mainland China. And the state will try to claim because there has been protests that demonstrates well we respect their autonomy. The point is they have gradually and very obviously tried to erode that away. One country, two systems was meant to last until 2047, the principles of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Now China has completely disrespected that, which is most importantly an insult to Hong Kongers, but it's also an insult to the United Kingdom in terms of the fact that we were joint signatories. China's disregarded that. They have not respected the autonomy until 2047. They have gradually but very obviously tried to erode that autonomy long before 2047. And it's 27 years away. So if anyone really believes, the likes of Wang Yi, that this is, they'll respect the autonomy and this is only designed to target troublemakers, that is very, very gullible thinking when you consider the book booksellers in Hong Kong who have been kidnapped, brought to the mainland. Why? Because they're selling books critical of Xi Jinping and its regime. I also think that this has been rushed through for a few reasons. They know that the world is focusing on coronavirus, so it's a good opportunity to kind of rush this in while the world focused on that, because they perhaps rightly think, okay, well, the world's kind of going to overlook this. And in a way, we have, because we've been so focused on the Dominic Cummings story. I still believe it's important, but we really can't ignore this, and we need to issue potentially emergency visas, not only to the British, those who were born in the territory before the handover, i.e., British I forget what's called British passport holders, British overseas passport holder. I forget the formal name, excuse me, but also any Hong Konger who may well be a political dissident. Now, if someone has actually committed violence, for example, if they've thrown Molotov cocktails at police or they've they've engaged in violence, it will be, I think, from a diplomatic point of view, hard for Britain to protect those people. But the overwhelming majority of protesters throughout all of this have been peaceful. I'm not disputing that there has been some violent ones, but in a way, that's a natural response to weeks and weeks of police brutality. I mean, I'm not condoning them attacking ordinary people, but if they fight back against the police, I can't say I have a great deal of sympathy for the police when they have been engaging in blatant brutality from the start. That needs to be understood. Um, But it's very troubling when you have an authoritarian single party state trying to label its opponents terrorists as a way to legitimize these sort of moves. And it's just typical of the Chinese Communist Party in the sheer arrogance of not allowing dissent. In the case of Hong Kong, they want, make no mistake about it, the Chinese Communist Party want Hong Kong to be just another subservient Chinese city. Because if you had a demonstrate. I mean, it would be unthinkable to have an anti-government demonstration in any other Chinese city. That's why the situation in Hong Kong is so important. But they've disregarded one country, two systems, basically, and that, in my opinion, is enough for the British side to make at, at least a formal protest, summon the ambassador, something. We really need to send out a message here because anyone who thinks, oh well, it's just the who can blame the Chinese are just dealing with the rioters. You're really overlooking what's been going on in Hong Kong. This affects every single Hong Konger who is wary about the communist regime, not just rioters, every single person who has voiced dissent in Hong Kong. It's extremely dangerous. And I don't blame the Hong Kongers for being concerned about this because it is just the latest development in what the Chinese communist regime's been doing for years in Hong Kong, gradually but surely trying to erode freedoms there. Um, so I think we need to issue emergency legislation so that when the lockdown ends, when the flight restrictions end, and that's a difficult thing because they could be sentencing these people very soon, so it's a difficult balancing act. But there's another point. People might say, oh, why are they protesting during the lockdown restrictions? Well, I would be prepared to say, okay, well, the Hong Kong government has brought in public gathering restrictions as a measure against coronavirus, but it is a bit suspicious that they extended those restrictions, the lockdown that is, to cover the date of the 5th of June, which traditionally is a date where there is commemorative ceremonies and rallies to remember the Tiananmen Square massacre. So it just looks a bit too coincidental that the Hong Kong government just extends the lockdown to cover that particular period. It just seems a bit of a coincidence. Um, of course, Hong Kongers should respect the fact that there is a deadly virus out there, like the rest of the world is. But in the case of Hong Kong, unlike those gun nuts who are storming the Michigan state capitol, Hong Kongers have an actual reason to worry about their freedom being threatened. Um, so I really think this is a grave situation, and it is yet another reminder of why we cannot trust the Chinese regime. They have lied, they have intimidated, and they have violated the Sino-British Joint Declaration and one country, two systems. It's basically now one country, one system. And everything but name, Hong Kong is getting closer and closer and closer to just being another subservient communist city. No different from Wuhan or Shanghai or Guangzhou or Zhengzhou or Foshan, Xiamen, you name it. That's what they want to see happen. And I think we've got a moral responsibility to take a stance on this. At the very least, I think we should be summoning the Chinese ambassador.